Hey there, you're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm your host, Scott Crockett, as we explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, policy, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On today's episode, we're back with BCA's economics team, Mike Holden and Alicia Planincich, to break down the fall 2024 update of the Alberta Snapshot, an all-point summary of the Alberta economy. If you find this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and giving us a quick review and rating. Now, on to the show. Welcome back to your quarterly economic update with the Business Council of Alberta and the leaders of our policy and economics team, Mike Holden and Alicia Planincich, to talk about what's happened in Canada and in Alberta's economy since we last met. And folks, this is one of those times that it feels like there's been movement, there's been news since we last met. So let's just jump right into it. Mike, kick us off. Broadly speaking, how's the economy looking in Alberta specifically and nationally generally?
Well, we're seeing a general slowing trend start to come into the economy. I mean, we've been expecting this for a long time. Interest rates were rising, and that was supposed to drive a decrease in economic growth. And we started to see that deceleration and seeing interest rates falling as a result. And so we're seeing on the whole, and you can see this the most actually in the job market. So Alberta had a pretty good month in November. The numbers were actually, or in October rather, the numbers were just released today. But over the last 6 or 8 months, we've seen a general slowing trend across Canada and in the province.
And how's Alberta compare to nationally?
Well, if we're talking about job market specifically, it's actually doing fairly well. In fact, I think we're creating jobs like on a year-over-year basis. We're creating jobs at about twice the national average rate. But the challenge, of course, is that the provincial population is also growing significantly faster than the rest of the country. So the province has been struggling to keep its job creation up to the population growth. And so that's why, we see that unemployment rate in the province, it's now at 7.3%. And that's, it's higher than the national average. And sometimes we're not used to thinking about Alberta as being a high unemployment rate jurisdiction. But a lot of that really has to do with this churn that we're seeing in the labor market and population coming in and the overall job creation rate slowing.
And that is news, to be thinking of Alberta as a place that has a higher than average unemployment rate. The headlines continue to look positive. Highest economic growth in the country, highest economic growth forecasts, big in-migration sort of numbers, big job creation numbers, but some signs that we're not immune to the sort of macroeconomic and slowing national conditions. Alicia, you've highlighted a number of warning signs, and as Mike mentions, it's jobs day today. I know that there's aspects of the labor market you're concerned about. What are you worried about?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is what Mike said with this really slowing jobs creation trend, where over this past 6 months, the number of new jobs added is just a small fraction of what we were seeing in the 6 months before that. And that is really most evident in what we call the goods sector. So think manufacturing, construction, oil and gas in particular, right? It was really adding a whole bunch of jobs. And then that growth has really leveled off in the recent months.
And when you talk about the good sectors, you mean the ones that pay relatively high wages and that kind of thing? Is that
high wages, high productivity, jobs that matter a whole lot to Alberta for sure. And that's really where we've seen the growth, unfortunately, level off.
Right. And so what do you think that could mean for Alberta's overall economic health? What's the labor market telling us about the overall economy? I know most of us probably think about our job first when we think about the economy, but how about the broader implications?
Yeah, what we say about the labor market is we call it a lagging indicator. In other words, it tells us what's already happened. So the fact that businesses aren't creating as many jobs means that what they've already seen is consumer demand has really slowed down for them. In fact, one of the things that we've seen nationally that I suspect is happening in Alberta is that most businesses aren't necessarily laying off their workers, but they're not adding as many new jobs. And so when we think about who's most affected by this, it's really hit folks that are new to the labor force really hard. So think about, newcomers. So folks, that are immigrating to Alberta more recently. It's going to be much harder to find a job in the Alberta labor market today than it was last year.
Right. So I think there's two really interesting dynamics you've pulled on there. Tell me if I characterize these correctly. But one is this idea that the Alberta economy can be doing really quite well, creating jobs, but due to population growth, there's this sort of running to stand still or running to barely move forward kind of aspect to it, that the amount of new population growth means you could be adding jobs, but even yet sort of falling further behind on a month-to-month basis.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and I think that one of the other elements that is pointing to this decline in job creation and labor market activity is if you look at the job vacancy rate in the province. So that spiked to historic high levels in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's been coming down pretty rapidly. And we're now at a point where I believe there are three vacant positions, no, three people who are unemployed for each vacant position that exists in the province. So that's, again, further indication that we're seeing the slowdown. And part of what we're seeing happening is that companies, when they're scaling back on labor market growth, on adding new people, we're not seeing large scale layoffs right now, but what we are seeing is vacant positions that companies have had for a while that they're just deciding to not fill them.
Well, and I think that's the second dynamic I wanted to pull on, which is, who's being most affected by this? Because normally, if we were sitting here during a relatively high unemployment period in Alberta, we would be talking about layoffs at companies and that kind of thing. And as you just said, we're not really talking about that. In fact, many of these companies are still creating jobs. So when you sort of, look around at maybe if you've been here a while, the people say, well, it can't be that bad. I don't really know anybody who's doing big layoffs at the moment. But, put a finer point on that. Who's finding it the hardest to find work at the moment?
Yeah, just to add to that point a little bit earlier about, folks new to the labor market. So in particular, newcomers, so folks who are new to Alberta as of the last 5 years, their unemployment rate has increased from 10% last year to 15% today. So that is a huge increase of a group which already had a high unemployment rate. 15%, that's basically double the current average.
So, are there any positives in the labor market outlook to share with our listeners?
Well, there are a few general positives. It depends on how you're asking. If you're looking at Alberta compared to the rest of the country, the province, because our population is relatively younger and because our sort of older Albertans tend to work longer than they do in other parts of the country, we do still have higher labor market participation. People are more active in the labor market here. The employment rate is higher. And so we have these areas where Alberta still continues to be strong relative to the rest of the country. But at the same time, it is still declining like it is every place else. Like conditions are, they're slowing, but we're just slowing from a higher starting point.
Right. A very interesting kind of dynamic to calibrate, emotionally. We're sort of at a bit of a midpoint here where we could be looking better than most of the rest of the country, but we also have to be honest with ourselves that we're slowing in many of those ways.
Yeah, and also like part of what's happening here is that we're seeing this slowdown in economic growth, which was, in a sense, deliberate. This was what rising interest rates were for, was to tamp inflation down, and that means slowing economic growth. And so we're seeing that, and we're also starting to see a bit of the light at the end of the tunnel already. With, we've had a number of interest rate cuts already, and those will not have an immediate effect on the economy, but it does show us that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Because if the Bank of Canada is at the point where, and not just the Bank of Canada, but central banks around the world, if they're starting to decrease interest rates, that there could still be economic weakness ahead of us. But like I said, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, because eventually those declining rates will start to spark more business investment, spark more consumer spending, and help employment start picking back up again.
Well, I was going to ask about it later, but you've introduced the concept of interest rates. So let's go there for a moment, because since we last did one of these quarterly snapshots, we've seen 3 Bank of Canada interest rate cuts, as well as another substantial cut of a different kind, a substantial cut to the number of new immigrants that Canada's planning to accept over the next couple of years. How have these two factors changed your economic outlook?
Well, maybe I can answer the interest rate one, and Lish knows more about immigration than I do, so that'd be a good one for you.
Being an immigrant herself, I think that is objectively accurate.
Yes, it is.
in addition to her professional capacity.
And it is on that basis that she's an expert. So with the interest rates, I think we're now at a point where declining rates creates a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel view. But I think the important thing to remember, though, is that it takes a long time for changes in interest rates to filter through to the entire economy. So when interest rates were rising, it happened fairly abruptly. And so those effects still have not made their way through the economy. And so the best way to think about this is a couple of ways. So if you imagine on the sort of personal finance level, if you have a 5-year fixed mortgage and you got that mortgage about 3 or 4 years ago, you got it at a pretty enviable interest rate. And so if that mortgage comes up for renewal in the next year or so, even if interest rates are on their way back down, you're still going to end up paying a lot more than you were before that. And so it takes a long time for those kinds of impacts to filter through. And then similarly on the business investment side, just because interest rates are down right now or falling right now, it doesn't mean companies are sitting around just waiting to flick a switch and on a whole bunch of new investment activity now that rates have decreased a little bit. Right. It takes a long time to plan these things. And so you need to be able to develop these plans, secure financing, do everything that needs to be done. And so there's a long delay before those kinds of reactions to filter through the economy as well.
So do you think it's accurate to say that even though rates are being cut now, we still haven't felt the full impact of the increases that came before them?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
And Lish, on immigration, what do you think is the implication of this big immigration cut, frankly, that we've seen announced? We could parse it a little bit more specifically than that, but I think that's the headline.
Yeah, I mean, so the short story with immigration is that population growth was really papering over the fact that Canada's economy was otherwise in a recession over the last year, right? And so there's going to be a very real and strong impact of no longer seeing that growth, of just adding more people to the economy. Now, I think the better and deeper question is really, how will this affect our standard of living? And I think that's probably much more complicated for this podcast and goes beyond even what the Bank of Canada, I think, can kind of expect. There's also another question that I'll just raise, which is, will we actually see as sharp of a decline in population growth as as the immigration levels plan expects, which is essentially to go from 3% a year, extraordinarily high, all the way down to 0%. So that's kind of another question too in my mind is, will we actually see this play out?
So you've hinted at something there, come right out and say it. Why might we not see the levels plan play out in the way that, has sort of been announced?
Yeah, so there are a whole bunch of policies that are coming into play essentially to bring down the number of immigration. And a big part of that is not just decreasing the number of new people coming into Canada, but actually decreasing the number of folks who are here temporarily, whether that be on a work permit or a study permit, right? This number has just absolutely ballooned over the last few years and needs to decrease substantially over the next couple of years based on the levels plan. So whether or not that actually happens and folks actually do go back home, there's so many different issues to work out there. And so I think that's the question that's a little bit up in the air for folks.
Yeah, with this enormous number of temporary or non-permanent residents who are currently in Canada, there's a big question mark on if they will return home at predictable rates, along what the government would like to see. I think there's good reason to believe that it may not play out exactly as the government might want to see it. And you produced a chart not that long ago that I think just perfectly told the story in one chart that showed immigration levels since about the 70s. And it sort of bumps along at relatively predictable rates, a little bit higher, a little bit lower. Then you can see over the last couple of years, it just shoots up to this level that's totally out of step with the previous graph. And then you forecasted ahead what the new cut will look like, and it's way down below the bottom that we'd ever had before. Would you characterize this as, slamming on the gas and then slamming on the brakes?
It totally feels like that. And I think that's a big question too, in terms of how do markets and businesses respond? So especially thinking about, residential construction, they've been building, trying to meet this unmet demand. And now all of a sudden, they're building for thinking about a couple of years out, but now they're not expecting growth anymore. So what do they do? Or I think there are some really big unknowns. We've never seen anything like that, at least not in the last 50 or 60 or however many years back my chart goes, right? Like this is really like nothing we've ever seen.
And sometimes a chart just says, instantly to you, this doesn't seem like really thoughtful strategic planning. And that's the thing that I took away from that one. We'll post it in the show notes and re-up it for everyone to see. Let's go back to, I think, one of the other biggest issues that people have been talking about around their proverbial kitchen tables, as we often say. But that is literally where my family talks about our budget, which is spending and affordability. What's happening in terms of what Albertans are spending? When we last sat down here, we had this interesting conversation that overall the amount of retail spending, how much people were buying in stores, the total volume was going up, but the amount per person was going down. And, sort of a population growth story you can see there. Where are we at today?
Well, we're pretty much at the same place, except that we're no longer seeing the total spending increase. And so,
ray of sunshine, you.
Yeah, I know. It's great. And so effectively, total retail spending in the province has been relatively flat over the last few months. We're not seeing a lot of growth. I mean, it is still positive, but only barely so. But we are seeing a continued steady decline in per person spending. And so the reason for this, we've talked about this before. So over the last little while, we've seen high inflation, which has come back down, but prices remain elevated. And wage growth has picked up recently and is now, wages are growing faster than inflation is in Alberta, and it's been that way for the last 6 months or so. But that was not the case for a long period before that. Effectively, the amount that Albertans had to spend on things was falling because the price of the goods they were buying was rising a lot faster than the wages that they were buying them with. And then on top of that, you've got housing and rental costs have increased significantly. And so Albertans are feeling the pinch, and so they're not spending as much as they did before. And so their relative purchasing power is lower than it was pre-pandemic, and we're seeing that reflecting in the retail trade data.
So let's zoom in on one part of that you opened up. One of the other big conversations that happens around kitchen tables is about the housing market. What's happening in Alberta's housing market today?
Yeah, so the concern there was we were seeing for a long time with this huge population growth into the province was that, we would have, I forget, do you remember what the stat was of the number of people that we had relative to the new housing that we built?
200,000 new people moving in and roughly 20 to 25,000 new homes being about the most that we'd ever built in any given year. And even if you figure that a couple people live in each home, you still see that there's an enormous delta there.
I remember the 200,000. I was like basically adding 2 Red Deers in 6 months.
Yeah.
That's the stat I remember. In the housing, I wanted to say it was like 38,000, but still, you have, even if you divide that 200,000 people by, 2 or 3 people living in a house, or 4 even, we weren't building homes at anywhere near the rate that was needed to keep up with demand. And so we've seen, just to sort of steal Lish's point here for half a second, on a sort of the first 3 quarters of 2024 compared to the same period last year, we're seeing a pretty substantial spike in new housing starts across the province. It's up around 33 to 35%, I believe. And we're not seeing that kind of growth anywhere else in the country, which is a good news story for Alberta. In parts of Atlantic Canada, it's increasing about that rate. But interestingly enough, the places that we think of that have the most stress on their housing markets, so that's in BC and in Ontario, their housing starts have actually declined compared to the same period in 2023. So that's an interesting point that we're following as well.
Well, and it's always nice when the economic points sort of play out with facts on the ground. And I can say what it feels like in Calgary and Edmonton, both of which I spent a bunch of time in lately, is you can see this residential construction visibly happening, the densification, the fourplexes and larger than that, and the transit-focused developments. I haven't been to Grand Prairie or Fort McMurray or Medicine Hat, so, I haven't been there in the last couple of months. Maybe someone can write us an email and tell us how they're doing. But I feel like you can see it on the streets of the largest cities in Alberta.
And you can see it in my backyard, too. They're starting to build behind there. So
right.
there goes my view.
Well, there's your opportunity to truly become a literal NIMBY if you choose to be, but I encourage you not to. Anything else you wanted to say on the housing market there, Lish?
No, I think that covers it.
So tell us, is there any good news for Alberta businesses and Alberta consumers on the horizon?
Well, I think we touched on one of them already, which was the falling interest rates. And so I mentioned before how it takes a long time for that kind of thing to play out, because using the 5-year mortgages as an example. On the bright side, however, anybody who's carrying, consumer debt, whether it's, your credit card debt or line of credit at the bank, you're going to start to see a little bit of price relief in those areas. And then, like I said, there's a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, because we know that eventually as rates decrease, that consumer spending power will start to pick back up again.
I'll just add too, I think the biggest bit of big news is that things haven't fallen apart, right? We haven't seen a huge increase in bankruptcies among consumers or businesses. Business expectations for the future are not super positive, but they're also not negative. And so I think that's my biggest positive, is just things are still moving along.
We talked a bit about sort of the retail sector, consumer spending, that kind of thing. What are we seeing on the more manufacturing, production, and industrial side of our economy?
Okay, so now you are taking me into one of the areas where there's a little bit more negativity. So looking at that same business expectation survey, but among particular industries, manufacturing is by far the most negative of any of Alberta industries. And we also see, if we look at the equivalent sales data in that industry, it's really leveled off. So after we saw that huge amount of growth, partly driven by high commodity prices, we've really seen things moderate and stagnate over the last few months. And I think this is largely just a reflection of what we're seeing globally in the economy, right? Consumer demand is softening, is the economist term for it, but it's just, it's it's not as strong as it was. And so I think we're feeling that here too in Alberta.
And manufacturing, is that a leading or a lagging indicator?
That would be a bit more of a leading indicator for sure.
So definitely a little bit of a warning sign about things to come.
It is for sure.
So it's difficult to talk about Alberta's economy or even Canada's economy without putting ourselves sort of in the larger global context. So let's zoom all the way back out again now. What economic trends are we seeing globally? What's on the horizon that might affect us?
So the two big ones, the one is actually a huge positive, which is that I think central banks, the way they see it is they have beat inflation, right? So most advanced countries have seen inflation back down to normal levels. Now, for consumers, does that mean that prices have gone down? No, it absolutely doesn't. But in terms of their fight against inflation, they really see it as in the rearview mirror, which is huge, right? Because I think there was a long time when economists didn't think that we could do this without basically causing a recession, right? So that's the big good news story is that inflation has come down and for the most part, things are moving along. On the other side, though, like I was saying earlier, consumer demand certainly is slowing. So we are seeing some softening,
and that's
but
globally,
we're not seeing exactly, but we're not seeing the bottom fall out.
And how about major world events? Since we've last recorded this in the last couple of weeks, there's certainly been a major world event in that we now know that Donald Trump's going to be the president of the United States again. This could have implications. We'll have to do another podcast on geopolitics, but it'll certainly have implications with Russia and China and in the Middle East. Just in a broad sense, how could this affect us and our economic outlook?
It's funny, we were talking about just how difficult economic projections are, just always. That is a very difficult thing to do. And so to add a Trump administration into this, I think we just have to remember that just even further widens the range of possibility, good or bad, of what on earth could happen.
In fact, it's actually the perfect example of why long-term economic forecasts should always be either taken with a grain of salt or, just be careful with what they mean. Because if you think about it, a Trump presidency, including things like the possibility of slapping a 10 or 20% tariff on all goods coming into the U.S., that would have a massive impact on any economy or on the global economy. And so that's exactly the kinds of things that long-term economic forecasts by definition, cannot ever capture. You don't know that kind of thing is coming 3 years down the road. It's going to make for an interesting and challenging next few years, depending on what happens, because we don't know what's going to happen.
One thing I will add to that as much as it is unknown if he will in fact go forward with that pulse idea that he put out on the campaign trail, there is, and I think this would have even been true in a Harris administration, is that there's been this shift to protectionism, right? We did live in a world of free trade, and now it is very in vogue, this idea of protectionism. And even in the IMF's latest forecast, this is before the election had been settled, they were noting this as a big risk in their forecast because this will really change things, right? This will really have an effect on all countries and consumers in a very big way.
Yeah, and protectionism makes everyone poor. It's worth remembering that and restating it. And I guess a lot of us are going to have to dust off the economics textbooks from like the early part of the 1900s to see the last time we really went through like a global round of serious protectionism, because we could be headed there again.
For sure.
We always like to finish off with a bit of a lightning round, and included in this snapshot, as you often do, is an interesting statistic from our friend Janet Brown, who polls Albertans, and she talks about how Albertans are feeling about their own finances, but also how they're feeling about the economy looking forward. Just unpack that for us. How are Albertans feeling today? What does her data show, and why do you think they're feeling that way?
Yeah, the data is really interesting. So it asks two questions. It asks for households to describe their individual financial situation. So, would they describe their finances currently as good, bad, or maybe in the middle? But then also to describe the Alberta economy. And we see this really interesting trend where a lot of Albertans say that their own financial situation is actually pretty good or okay.
Like about half of them are good, and then 30+% are okay. Yeah,
totally. But then on the flip side, most Albertans think that the Alberta economy is weak or weakening. Right. And this is actually a trend that we've seen in other polling, even in the US as well. And there's a lot of conversation around why that is. Maybe I'll pass it over to Mike if you want to shed any hypothesis on that.
On why that is? As Lish pointed out earlier, so we've got a whole bunch of things happening at once. There's large population increases is effectively papering over weak economic growth, as she mentioned. But there are more of us around. There's more activity. There's more vibrancy. There's more people buying and selling goods. Individuals are buying less. But at the same time, as she pointed out earlier, we're not seeing the kind of bankruptcy and insolvency that we would think that we would see if affordability is really hitting people as hard as they're worried. And so, what we might be seeing here is just some general optimism in Alberta about, people's own personal states. And what it might be is that there's a lot of negativity in the reporting about the Canadian economy recently. And a lot of I'd say it's not unfounded. But maybe what we're seeing here is that people are looking at their own personal experiences and then reading about what the general consensus is in the economy and deciding that those two stories aren't fully matching up.
And I think that is probably true for a lot of people. Mike, Lish, thanks a lot for doing this. See you again next quarter.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd also love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on all the social medias. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show or tell somebody about it. Your support means the world to us and lets us keep making more episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or pretty much everywhere else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every Tuesday.